Good morning. My name is Paul Holtham, and I'm the head of the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR for short. I'd like to begin by warmly welcoming you all to today's conference on Inside the Networks, How Knowledge Transfer Drives Improvised Weapons Production. Thank you for joining us both online and here in Geneva. It's a pleasure to see such a wide range of expertise gathered with us today, so I promise this opening panel will be short so we can get to the substance quickly. But before turning to the substance, I'd like to begin with two opening presentations. First, UNIDIR's director, Dr. Robin Geis, is unable to be with us in person, but he's very kindly prepared a recorded message, which will now play, hopefully.
To welcome all of you to this international conference. Our knowledge exchange enables the production of improvised weapons around the world. I would like to start by extending our deep appreciation to all of you for taking part, whether in Geneva or online. The involvement of such a diverse range of participants representing member states, international and regional organizations, law enforcement, academia, and civil society underscores our shared commitment to addressing the important issue of improvised weaponry. Though I sadly cannot be with you in Geneva today, I'd like to share some very brief reflections on the issue that you will be unpacking over the course of the coming session. First, the landscape of armed violence and conflict is changing, with improvised weapons playing an increasingly significant role in modern warfare and crime. From the weaponized drones we see in Myanmar, in Sudan, and Ukraine, to the do-it-yourself firearms used by criminals and terrorists in Africa, the Americas, and Europe, improvised weapons are undermining peace, security, and development across the globe. Second, improvised weapons are increasingly sophisticated and accessible. Often assembled from readily available materials and components, they leverage dual-use technologies, such as 3D printing, to remain undetected. This can make craft weapons an attractive, cost-effective option for criminals, non-state armed groups, and terrorists, creating new challenges for arms control authorities, law enforcement agencies, and security forces. Third, technical knowledge is a critical enabler, and for that reason, it is the main focus of our discussion today. The online and offline transfer and diffusion of know-how has transformed the landscape of weapons production. Practices and techniques that were once the preserve of states and organized groups can now be replicated, adapted, and shared globally in real time. This is why we urgently need to go beyond a siloed approach when it comes to controlling the production, the transfer, the acquisition of these weapons. While the spread and evolution of improvised small arms and light weapons, IEDs, and drones may vary across contexts and regions, there remains a common thread. The unregulated, shape-shifting nature of these technologies is challenging established systems of arms control, mitigation, and response. Policy and practice are lagging behind, reactive rather than preventative, and clearly this needs to change, and fast. Today's conference will analyze this multifaceted problem, of course, but crucially, our desire and ambition is to also go on to identify pathways for coordinated, realistic solutions. The second step will be critical if we are to continue contributing meaningfully to the implementation of multilateral frameworks like the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, the Firearms Protocol, UN Security Council Resolution 2370, and the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, the Pact for the Future, and not to mention the many important regional processes already in place. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I encourage you to use this opportunity today to engage constructively, to make the most of the outstanding expertise gathered together for today's conference, and to translate our shared insights and understandings into achievable actions. Only this kind of approach will allow the international community and stakeholders across the board to make real progress on preventing the proliferation of improvised weapons and mitigating their devastating impact on lives and livelihoods around the world. On behalf of UNIDIR and the organizing team, I thank you once again for your participation and your commitment, and I wish you all an engaging, enjoyable, and productive conference.
So thank you to our director, and to continue the hybrid nature of this morning's session, we'll now move to the second set of opening remarks, which will be delivered from here in the room in Geneva. And for this, it's my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Thomas Goebel, the permanent representative of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. And I'm delighted that you're able to join us in what I know is a busy week. And I'd now like to invite you to deliver your opening remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to join you this morning to open this important conference on improvised weapons production. And I would like to thank you all for your presence here, and as I understand, also online. My special thanks certainly goes to Paul Holtum and the whole team of UNIDIR's Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program for organizing this very timely event. The breadth of expertise represented today is impressive, but I think it's needed also. It's needed because it is indispensable to confront the emerging and rapidly evolving challenges that the international community is facing. One of these challenges, the uncontrolled and improvised production of improvised explosive devices, small arms and light weapons, and uncrewed aerial systems, will stand in the center of your considerations today. As you embark on this important discussion, allow me to highlight some key elements. First, the landscape of weapons proliferation has transformed dramatically over the past decade. Capabilities that were once limited to states and industrial arms manufacturers are now within reach of individual hobbyists, criminal networks, and terrorist organizations. The impact of this shift has been witnessed from conflict settings to individuals using firearms with 3D printed components to commit terrorist attacks. This shift has profound implications for arms control. We must now prevent not only the diversion of legally manufactured weapons, but also the decentralized and illicit production of increasingly sophisticated improvised systems. Second, improvised weapons production has advanced in quality and accessibility. Improvised conventional weapons are now developed with emerging and dual-use technologies. Yet, hardware alone does not explain this evolution. Knowledge transfer has become an equally powerful enabler, whether through the exchange of information among armed groups, cross-theater learning from conflicts such as Ukraine and Myanmar, or the online dissemination of instructions and blueprints. This diffusion of expertise has broadened both the reach and the impact of improvised weapons production. It is now a global challenge affecting all regions of the world in different but interconnected ways. It will continue to evolve across geographical borders and digital barriers. With this in mind, it is more than important to think collectively and concretely about the actionable step that can be taken at the national, regional, and international levels to curb the spread of improvised weapons. It is a moment to rethink traditional approaches to arms control, and I'm glad that this conference will start with it today. At the level of policy frameworks, different types of conventional weapons like small arms or improvised explosive devices have often been addressed through separate instruments. The proliferation of improvised weapons challenges us to adopt a more integrated and comprehensive approach. Such an approach should build on existing mechanisms, including the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms, the Firearms Protocol, the Anti-Personal Mine Ban Convention, Security Council Resolution 2730, and the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. Yet, a siloed approach, and Director Geis had already said it, will not allow us to address the full complexity of improvised weapons production. At the level of key stakeholders, like you here in the room and online, a far wider range of actors is now relevant to this effort, from member states, law enforcement agencies to international and regional organizations, industry, social media platforms, civil society, academia, and open source intelligence experts. If the decentralized nature of improvised weapons production has multiplied challenges, and it has undoubtedly, it has also broadened the range of potential solutions and possible actors. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today's meeting presents a promising beginning, a first step towards developing a more comprehensive and integrated approach to preventing and mitigating the impacts of improvised weapons. The discussions ahead offer a unique first opportunity to enhance our understanding of the evolving dynamics of these threats across different regions, but they also represent an opportunity to identify concrete, coordinated measures to strengthen the implementation of relevant multilateral instruments, to assist member states in addressing the complex and emerging risks associated with improvised weapons production. Germany remains committed to supporting all partners in their efforts to better understand, prevent, and respond to emerging security challenges. We commend UNIDER and its conventional arms and ammunition program for its important research and initiative in this domain. I would like to wish all of you, all participants here in the room and online, an engaging exchange of ideas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador, for setting the scene and for giving us the challenge that we must try and address during the remainder of today, and I'm confident beyond this session as well. And thanks to you also for the generous support that continues to come to UNIDER, to our program, and that enabled us to hold and host this conference today as well. I'd now like to close the opening session and hand over to the masterminds of this initiative, Mathilde and Ruben. If you'd please like to come up to the front to start the discussions, deliberations, and to help inform colleagues about what is to come. Thank you.
Are we good?
So thank you very much, and welcome once again on my behalf and the behalf of UNIDER to this conference. And thanks, Ruben, for joining me on this panel. Before I introduce you and hand over the floor to you, please allow me to just refresh everyone's mind on why we're here today, how the structure of this discussion will be, and where it's placed within UNIDER's work and research. Great. So today we would like, as the opening remarks mentioned already, to discuss key linkages and trends across improvised small arms and light weapons, IEDs, and UAS, with a focus on the key role of knowledge transfer and online and offline knowledge transfer networks in the assembly, acquisition, and use of these weapons. We would also like to bridge the gap between relevant stakeholders on the issues. As the ambassador mentioned, there is not really an existing landing zone for these discussions, and so we would like to bring all relevant stakeholders together to look at these issues more closely. We would also like to take a little bit of a step forward and identify effective measures, existing good practices, or potential good practices that the stakeholders in the room and beyond can take to better prevent and mitigate the impact of improvised weapons devices across conflict and non-conflict settings. To do so, we have divided today in 4 substantive sessions. Session 1 and Session 2 will provide an overview of the issue, focusing on key developments in improvised weapons production and the role played by online and offline knowledge networks. These sessions, as my colleague May mentioned, will be live streamed and recorded. Session 3 and Session 4 in the afternoon will focus on specific case studies from different regions of the world and will discuss key effective measures that different stakeholders can implement to contribute to preventing the proliferation of improvised weapons. These sessions will not be live streamed nor recorded and will be held under Chatham House rule, which means your views can be used by other participants but can't be attributed to you or your organization. So please take that as an opportunity to express freely and openly. For participants joining online, if they would like to interact with the panels in any way, we will be projecting during Session 1 and Session 2 a Slido QR code. They're welcome to submit their questions online through that QR code, and we will relay them to the panel. Of course, due to time, we might not be able to relay all questions, but nevertheless, we'll try to strike a balance between the questions in the room and online, if there are any. Let me also remind everyone that this session and the conference plan to be open, interactive, and productive discussions. So be prepared to jump in, share your experience, your insights, and your regional perspective. This is particularly the case for Session 4, because Session 4 will not be a panel, but will be a tour de table moderated by UNIDIR. So we would really like to invite everyone to think towards that session in which we will be discussing good measures, effective practices, or concrete ideas for action. And so please already approach the first, second, and third session with that 4th session in mind. Some of you have already been in touch with us that they would like to bring some concrete examples or insights during Session 4 to the group. So first of all, many thanks to those. And if you already know that you would like to bring something concrete during the session, you can approach us in the breaks so that we can already inform the moderator and he can relay the floor to you directly during Session 4. So before we get to more substantive elements, I would also like to place this event into a larger context within UNIDIR. As many of you know, we have started this year working on a new initiative focused on improvised weapons, and this conference is the first milestone within this initiative. Our objective was to introduce a more holistic approach to the issue of improvised weapons that goes beyond the specific devices, SALW, IEDs, and UAS, and brings the linkages between these devices together. As probably many of you at UNIDIR, we've been conducting for years research on countering IEDs. We've been looking into the use of UAS by non-state armed groups, and we've been researching craft production of small arms and light weapons. Until very recently, we've been doing this sort of in parallel channels. And while doing this research, we realized that there are many overlaps between these different weapons in their uses and in their users, and that there is not really an existing platforms in which these overlaps can be further explored. And so this brings us to the conference today, which has the objective to really explore those overlaps. What led us to today's conference has been also a series of regional expert consultations that we've been conducting online since this year's spring, which have been gathering all UN regional groups. And through this series of online regional consultations, we have been highlighting some key elements that are common across weapons, the main one being the role of knowledge transfer in driving this production and reducing significantly the barrier between a potential producer and the weapon production itself. So building on this background, I would now like to start session one. And I think our priority should be to answer some key, basic, but critical questions to get this discussion started. And I thought there was probably no better way of doing so than asking them to the person that has been supporting us with this work since the beginning, which is Reben. So I prepared 3 larger questions for him on my side, and then we can, of course, open the floor for your questions. So for those who haven't met Reben yet, Reben Das is an associate research fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the RSIS in Singapore. So I have a couple of questions for him. The first one, and maybe the most basic one, we keep talking about improvised weapons, but improvised can mean a lot of things. So I think what can be useful is first, let's define what does this mean? What are we talking about when we refer to improvised weapons?
Thank you very much, Matilde, for that introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank UNIDIR, Paul, Matilde, and everyone for having me as part of this very interesting project. And so to jump right in, so what do we mean by improvised weapons? So improvised weapons fall under 2 broad categories. One would be the modification, conversion, and weaponization of non-lethal items into lethal items. This can be done either through the manufacture or the acquisition of certain components, right? And one example of weapons in this category would be conversion of blank firing firearms and also the reactivation of downgraded firearms. Now, converted firearms have caused more of a problem than real firearms in certain states, right? And they've been involved in several criminal and terrorist incidents as well. Apart from converted firearms and reactivated firearms, we also have conversion devices. Now, conversion devices are also known as drop-in autoseers for AR-15 systems, for example, and also switches for handguns and Glocks. And what these devices do is that they convert semi-automatic firearms into fully automatic, right? And to date, these devices are usually 3D printed in some cases, and till date, these devices are the most frequently encountered 3D printed firearm component globally, in particular in North America. And they have been used in several criminal events that have led to the killing of civilians and also many injuries, right? Apart from that, we also have what is called forced reset triggers, which are also components that don't necessarily convert firearms, but they simulate fully automatic fire. We also have drones. Now, drones have been, very, very prevalent in almost all the conflict theaters today, and they also are fall under this category of modification, conversion, and weaponization. We have 3D printed munitions, for example, like the picture on the top left there. That's of a candy bomb that has been used widely in Ukraine. That consists of a 3D printed casing and tail fin. We have 3D printed drones. We have IEDs and drone parts that have also been 3D printed. We have these repurposed conventional ammunition that have also been 3D printed, and we have seen, you know, a lot of these 3D printed munitions being attached to drone systems to carry out attacks on ground forces. So this is an example of you know, how modification and weaponization of drones also take place. Now, the second broad category of improvised weapons would be craft production from scratch. Now, this vary from, you know, very simple systems to the more advanced systems. Artisanal firearms is one example. Artisanal firearms, you know, are in several states a cottage industry. More recently, over the last 5-6 years, we've seen an increase in 3D printed firearms, and in this case, fully and hybrid 3D printed firearms. And if you can see the bottom row of pictures there, shows you, you know, several examples of models of fully and hybrid 3D printed firearms. And what we're seeing increasingly is a trend of these designs becoming more and more DIY and less reliant on regulated components, right? And the danger that this sort of causes is it reduces the external footprints that makers and manufacturers have, which then makes detection and interdiction much more challenging. The second photo on the bottom row is an example of a relatively new model called the Rhino, which is almost fully 3D printed, and it's even print in place, which means that it requires very little assembly. With this category, we also have craft-produced drones, and quadcopters, and also fixed-wing systems. An example would be the Liberator drone that was 3D printed and used in Myanmar as well. We also have improvised explosive devices and fully crafted munitions, fully craft-produced munitions. Now, these systems, you know, have been around for a while. They've been used by groups like, you know, ISIS, Al Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, and we're also seeing it being used till date.
Thank you, Ruben. I think you provided a very exhaustive answer to my first question. And I think you listed most of what falls under improvisation of small arms and light weapons, IEDs, and UAS. Now, my question is, we work on them separately. They have specific different technical elements, different developments. Why should we start to look them when improvised jointly?
Yeah, thank you, Matilde. So why do we look at them jointly? So I think, you know, number one, we're seeing a lot of these improvised weapon systems, you know, increasingly comprise of a combination of technologies and systems, right? And, you know, we're seeing, for example, as I mentioned before, 3D printed drones, 3D printed munitions, right? 3D printed munitions being, you know, attached to drones. So we also even see, you know, small arms and light weapons being attached to drones, you know, to carry out attacks. So, you know, what we're seeing is an increasing diffusion of technology, and, you know, what I like to call a hybridization of the threat at play. So it really doesn't make, you know, sense to look at it in silos. I think we have to look at it jointly. You know, these technologies are also becoming cheaper. They're becoming more accessible, and, you know, the barriers to entry are becoming lower, which means that, you know, people with, you know, minimal or mid-level capabilities are able to use these manufacturing techniques to manufacture these weapons. And a key enabler of that would be the proliferation of information online. And this does not only mean the dark web. There's a lot of information out there which is also available on the open web, you know, on the weaponization of these technologies. And of course, a lot of them are dual use in nature. they have legitimate commercial purposes and uses, which makes regulation much harder and more challenging. What we're also seeing is we're seeing a nexus of these technologies with conflict. Almost every conflict theater today, has witnessed the use of these technologies either singularly or as a combination of systems, as I mentioned. And a lot of these conflict theaters are breeding grounds for innovation with regards to these weapons. The Russia-Ukraine conflict would be a prime example. Interestingly, we're also seeing a nexus with crime, and what we're seeing is organized crime networks mimicking warfare techniques and tactics. Right, an example would be Mexican cartels who are adopting drones for attacks. An example would be the Jalisco cartel and their sort of rival groups, which have used drones using IEDs and munitions as shown in the picture above to carry out attacks on ground forces. Right? We've also seen an example of drones being used to transport drugs, cash, and weapons across the India-Pakistan border. An example would be recently, just a few weeks ago, there was a terror cell in Gujarat that was interdicted. They had planned to carry out a ricin attack in Ahmedabad, and that cell had received a weapons consignment from Pakistan using drones, and they had transported the weapons to Rajasthan, which the cell then collected by land, right? So this is an example of how drones are also being used. With terrorism, so at a group level, we're seeing a lot more of these groups, experimenting and employing these technologies, 3D printing and drones, for example. Al-Shabaab is a good example who, have been noted to have experimented with 3D printing to manufacture drones, IED components, and other weapons. We've seen them also try and recruit skilled personnel to do that for them. Apart from the sort of the examples from the Islamist milieu, we also have rebel groups in Colombia, for example, the FARC dissident groups, ELN, EMC, who have very actively used drones. Apart from groups, we also have independent lone actors and cells who have also actively attempted to use these weapons. An example would be the 2023 Finland cell. This cell had manufactured 4 FGC-9s and that planned to use these 3D printed firearms in attacks against strategic targets in Finland. More recently, we had a plot in Belgium that involved drones, and this cell involved 4 teenagers who had planned to use drones to assassinate politicians in the country, including their prime minister.
Great, thank you, Revan. So this brings us to my third and last question, and then I will be happy to open the floor. But I think you made it very clear of what these devices might have in common in terms of use and in terms of users, and I think the panels that will follow will dig a lot deeper into that and concrete examples. Now, what is the role in all of these of knowledge and knowledge transfer, which is why we're gathered here today? Why is it an interesting angle to look at when we're thinking of improvised weapons devices?
Thank you, Matilde. So knowledge, I think knowledge is key. As we talk about, hardware, without knowledge, you can't really, weaponize these hardware and these systems. Now, so knowledge is key. There are several types of knowledge transfer that has taken place, is still taking place. One example would be the knowledge transfer across groups. Right, we're seeing different groups from different ideologies, working together, to transfer knowledge and to weaponize these systems. An example of that would be the Houthis, Al-Shabaab, and AQAP, who have worked together to sort of transfer knowledge and expertise with regards to the weaponization of drones. We also see African Islamic State affiliates, for example, learning and receiving support from their Middle Eastern affiliates with regards to the weaponization of drones. We also see a transfer from conflict zones to organized crime. As I mentioned before, the Mexican cartels are a good example. We've seen members of the Mexican cartels even traveling to Ukraine to receive training with regards to drone techniques, and then they import those expertise back to the countries, very much similar to how foreign terrorist fighters have done in the past. In this day and age, online transfer of knowledge is something we can't sort of run away from, and this is taking place via open source websites, the dark web, and also encrypted messaging platforms. Several groups, both criminal and terrorist groups and also non-state actors, have also increasingly developed their own in-house knowledge and expertise. An example of that would be HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, who had developed their own drone brigade called the Al-Shaheen Brigade. We've seen also the Jalisco cartel developing their own drone unit in Mexico, and also guerrilla groups in Colombia. And finally, I think a very important point to note is the role of youth. Now, youths are increasingly at the crossroads between technological development and weaponization of these technologies. We've seen several groups trying to tap on the technological proficiency of youths and trying to get them to develop weapons for them. EMC is an example in Colombia, which has tried to use youths and recruit them to develop drones and other technological weapons for them. We've seen non-state actors also use them in Myanmar. So the role of youth is something that is key and something that we should look at quite closely as well.
Thank you very much, Robin. This concludes the questions that I had for you, and to sort of put us all up to speed in terms of what we think of when we talk about improvised weapons and why it's relevant to talk about small arms and light weapons, IEDs, and UAS within the same forum. So let me just remind for those online that that's the QR code where they can drop potential questions. That's just for the people following us in the live stream. There is also a link in the YouTube page that you can use to insert questions. I'll give that some time. So in the meantime, I would like to take questions from the room or additions or observations on what Ruben has mentioned. Doesn't necessarily have to be a direct question to the panel. If you'd like to ask a question, just please turn your placard so that I can see it from here. So the floor is now open. Yeah, I see one placard here and then one over there. So Evgenia, I'll give you the floor, and then I see the sir in the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. Good morning, dear participants. First of all, I would like to congratulate UNIDIR on this important initiative. Indeed, crafting and converting of small arms and light weapons, IEDs and UAS needs to be analyzed thoroughly, and through understanding of interlinkages of this process and, of course, linkages to other issues, including terrorism. And with regard to the nexus with terrorism and to maybe inform the potential countermeasures, I would like to ask Ruben whether during your research you have observed any factors that might influence type and use of improvised weapons, for example, US by terrorist groups. You briefly mentioned that during your presentation, but maybe you could give some more details on that. And if I may, my second question is also whether you see that printing of US by non-state actors is a growing trend, taking into account that the technology is easy and cheap to buy. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Maybe we take also the other question and we group them a little bit. Yes, sir, go ahead. Sorry, I don't see your placard, but.
About the firearm, if it is efficient or not, and if it can be used for more than one time, and what type of the material will be if it is efficient.
Thank you very much. Ruben, would you like to take these couple of questions first? And then, yes, there's a third one. Sorry, I don't have full visibility. Yes, yes, Leon, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for giving the floor. My name is Leon Kesberg. I work at Europol in The Hague. One question, which I thought I saw missing from your presentation, but has become a great illegal source of weapons in Europe. And that's falsely branded pistols, which are produced at least on an illegal manner, but not in an individual craftsmanship, let's say, but more on industrial level, because we see large amounts of these weapons being seized and turning up. Is there any specific reason why this is not in your presentation? Maybe it's not considered as an improvised weapon, or is there some other reason? And can we consider this as improvised weapons since they are produced on more industrial illegal scale? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. Yes, maybe I relay this first group of questions to you, Ruben, and then if we have the time, we take another round. Thanks. And I'm happy to complement whatever you'd like, but please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. So with regard to the first question, right? So one of the factors that influence improvised weapons are the use of improvised weapons with regards to terrorist groups. So if we take the use of drones, for example, I think there are several factors that influence the use of these systems by terrorist groups. Number one would be territorial control. So a lot of these groups who have used these weapons hold some sort of territory which allows them a safe haven to experiment, and also safe routes for logistical supply into the territories that they control. And so that would be a factor. Second factor would be external support. Now, external support really determines the types of drones, types of systems and weapons that these groups have access to. So obviously with state support, some groups like the Houthis, for example, have access to much more advanced systems. Without a lot of support, groups like Islamic State affiliates would have to rely on commercial systems. So external support definitely plays a role. Third would be technical capability of its operatives to weaponize these systems. And that has been enabled, as we spoke about before, through knowledge transfers. And finally, I think at the grand scale of things, leadership and ideology also plays a factor. Now, whether the leadership of these groups are open and willing to employ these technologies, whether they are willing to experiment with these technologies also plays a factor in them adopting these technologies. And finally, it's also utility considerations, cost benefit analysis on the part of these groups, whether these systems would really advance the strategic goals of these groups given the cost that is used to weaponize this. So that would be one. Is the printing of UAS by non-state actors a growing trend? Definitely it is. I think, as you mentioned, it's a cheap technology. It's something that is dual use. It's commercially available. So we've seen a lot of groups trying to experiment with it, trying to employ it. The efficacy, again, it's very dependent on how good the makers of these systems are. But this sort of technology has definitely given these groups an avenue to find alternative weapons. In cases where they do not have direct access to these systems. Now, the second question relating to 3D printed firearms, whether they are efficient or not. Now, this really depends on the skill of the people or the individuals who are doing it or manufacturing these weapons. Individuals who are skilled and who have a lot of experience in them can definitely produce a firearm that is capable of firing several hundred shots. And definitely one that could cause a lot of damage. We're seeing these designs becoming more, as I mentioned, more DIY, less and less reliant on regulated components, which is also a huge sort of concern. But then, the efficacy again really depends on how good these makers are. And the third question.
Thanks, Revan. Yes, first, let me add to that I think it clearly, of course, depends on the skills of the producer and the individual. One main element is that to make a skilled individual now, it's much easier than it was years ago. There is a lot more guidance available. And so to develop those skills is exceptionally easier now than it was a decade ago. So that's on that second question, and I can get to your question, Leon, which I think is a very good one, referring, I believe, to replicas or weapons that are modified to falsely resemble an industrial production or brand. Which, yes, can definitely fall under the improvised umbrella. I think the answer that Revan provides in the list is a non-exhaustive list of examples that we have been looking at in our research, but definitely it can fall under this same umbrella. And as you say, it presents an issue that has came up quite a lot, especially in the European context. So yes, my short answer is yes, and happy if you bring in examples during the discussions related to these weapons. I think that would be extremely useful. Thanks. Maybe I think we definitely have time for a second round of questions. So I see Paul. Yes, please go ahead.
Compliments to Unity on convening today. It's an observation or a suggestion rather than a question. In terms of defining what improvised is, we might draw on how it was approached about a decade ago within the UN when we were trying to address the issue of how we define what an IED was. And I know it's only one of our three pillars we're dealing with here. But what we had there was that slight change which was happening in conventional munitions, but still made them improvised. And then we had let's say, the traditional fully improvised IED. And as we expand this, rightly so, into privately manufactured firearms and UAS, it becomes even more difficult to try and define it. So how that was addressed previously was it's characteristics-based. So you might end up with something that might help us as a community of practice going forward is a working definition. And it will almost be updated annually because the very nature of the asymmetric threat, we will have new emerging ways improvisation is being done. But if we have a standing, flexible, and often updated working definition might help us focus. And it's that very issue. We already have issue at the moment where we've had a definition here this morning, which is fit for purpose, but it still doesn't cover everything we're talking about. So I think effort there would be difficult to do at the start, but once we put that effort in, it'll help us shape what we mean when we're talking about improvised. It could be a suggestion.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, I think when it gets to terminology and these weapons, it's extremely tricky to nail down what falls under them. I think this for us is a first attempt, but I fully agree with you that this would probably, even more than yearly updates, you know, I mean, the more we try to put this in a slide, the more there is a latest model or update of the technology coming up. So I think suggestion well taken in the need to nail down what falls under this large umbrella. And I think this for us is really a first effort towards that. So thank you very much for that. Is there any additional question? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for giving me the floor and for the interesting discussions. My name is Richard Martens. I'm from the Dutch National Police, and I'm also a colleague of my neighbor as a co-driver in the Impact Firearms platform. And we have a lot of discussions internally with the experts on these topics, of course, because we see it as a great threat. And limiting to legislation, I was wondering, do you consider legislation as a good preventive measure? I'm asking this for two reasons. One of them is that I know Singapore has already legislation on blueprints, on the printing of, let's say, parts of firearms. And the other reason is that we're in the Netherlands, we're now concerning to adapt legislation on the topic itself. And it's not limited by blueprints, but it's more focusing on the intent of making parts of, for example, firearms, which is now increased to be punished increasement, which enables investigators to start the investigation on a very early stage, and you're also punishable already when you are intending to produce a part of a firearm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can give a short reply and then I hand over the floor to Reben. And I think this goes straight to session 4. So thank you for this forward-looking question. And we can definitely go back to that more in next sessions. But my short reply to that would be yes, absolutely. And I think in that sense, improvisation is a process, be it 3D printing or other, but it is a process. There are different steps within this process in which legislation can come in. And as you mentioned, blueprints are one, and several states are looking into that. But I think our best shot is preventing the production, as you say, right? Once this production has happened, it's a lot harder, as Reben was mentioning, to detect and trace and so on and so forth. And in that process, I fully would agree that there are several steps in which one is legislation that can come into attempting to prevent the production from beginning or completing. I would say that would be my short answer, but we can definitely go back into legislations and concrete examples of existing legislations or potential legislations in session 4, because I think many colleagues in the room have good examples on that. Reben, maybe you would like to complement?
Yeah, thank you, Matilde. And I would agree very much with what you said. Because I think hard measures like legislation and also intelligence-led operations are key in sort of interdicting this phenomenon. But I think what is more important is also preventive measures, as what Matilde says. And one example of it would be sort of digital defense mechanisms that can be incorporated into the software of 3D printers that prevent these design files from even being printed. I think that is something that would be quite useful in preventing this phenomenon. Of course, that comes with its own challenges, but that would be one. And also, of course, interagency cooperation. And I think another thing would be awareness, because we are seeing a lot of youths of late, getting involved in 3D printed firearms, being arrested for these offenses. So I think general awareness and education of these systems and of the flip side to 3D printing technology that's being increasingly sort of incorporated into educational curriculum in various countries is important as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reben. While I'll see if there's any question online, but in the meantime, is there any additional question or follow-up from the floor? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm from the Swiss Armed Forces in Switzerland, and you were mentioning that there were this Mexican cartel going to Ukraine, getting the knowledge. So how did this happen? And the follow-up question is, what is the interest of a state to give this knowledge to crime organizations? And what is the interest of a group like Houthi to transfer the knowledge? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So with regards to the Mexican cartels, I think it was a GTALK report that mentioned it. I'm not sure, Paddy, if you want to come in or.
Everybody is. It's been a much publicized activity. The basic premise of Latin American cartels sending people across to join the International Legion, and for those then to fight in Ukraine, not actually to sponsor the effort that Ukraine is conducting, but in order to learn the technology and learn the capability and then export those capabilities back into the cartels. That's it in a nutshell. There is, we have to be very, very cautious about the veracity of that. And we have to be very cautious about how much that is a deliberate attempt of a cartel to train somebody, or whether that's a genuine attempt to support the Ukrainian conflict. But our evidence points towards that is happening to a certain extent, but not to a large extent, and not to support some of the more shrill reporting.
Thank you, Paddy. And I think, with regards to the second question on the Houthis, so we've seen cooperation between the Houthis, AQAP, and Al-Shabaab, and one thing that the Houthis would gain from this cooperation would be, with regards to Al-Shabaab, would be because a lot of the arms that is coming in through maritime routes, and it is being some sources have noted that Al-Shabaab is involved, especially in the Somali waters. So they would provide protection and sort of a safe logistical route for these arms to come into the Houthis. So that would be the benefit that they have. With regards to AQAP, they have historically have had a pragmatic sort of relationship, with the group, despite their ideological differences, and so cooperation with them would sort of, in certain cases, provide plausible deniability for operations, especially in the south. So I guess that would be sort of the benefits that they have. Yeah.
Thank you, Reben and Paddy, for jumping in. I think also on these elements we'll have a lot more to discuss also in the next panel and in the closed door session, in looking more at those nuances and also at the extent to which interest and intent can be established. I think that's a very tricky element to define. So I think we'll have a chance to also look at that more closely, particularly in the afternoon. Many thanks for the question. Any additional question from the room or complement at this stage? If not, I'm happy to look a little bit at the questions online quickly. I think one question is if it's possible to pinpoint a couple of factors that changed the impact or enhanced the impact of improvised weapons in conflict and non-conflict settings. I think you covered that a little bit, Robin, but I don't know if, and in the answer to Evgenia as well, but maybe that also varies across regions. And a next question, I think this we will be able to cover more in session 4, but since the online participants won't be connected, a reflection on how can we restrict online knowledge transfer, if you know of any examples or examples in which such restriction has worked in preventing such diffusion. You might not have it right at hand, and if you don't, we will get back to this participant bilaterally. But yeah, these are a couple of the questions that I see online.
So I think with regards to the factors that enhance, the importance of these weapons, I think as I mentioned, I think that's linked to Evgenia's question as well would be, again, ultimately the accessibility of a lot of these weapons, particularly the dual use sort of technologies, have provided a lot of these groups an access and alternative access to weapons, especially in cases where they do not have direct access to commercial weapons. An example of that would be in Myanmar, where 3D printing was used for that, to create sort of weapons that would be used to raid military sort of establishments where conventional weapons would be confiscated. So I think one of it would be the ease of access and accessibility. With regards to how do we restrict online knowledge transfer at the moment?
I'm happy to jump in on that, not with a concrete example, because I think that will be more for session 4, but to reply to Nihat, who I know is following us online. And I think there has been some discussion around how to better enhance the practice of online investigations and cyber patrols, and if there is space of cooperation between law enforcement actors and the platforms that eventually host that content. I think that's a space in which we can surely look more at the level of prevention of diffusion of the knowledge or disruption of the knowledge being downloaded and uses. And I think we have some colleagues in the room that have been looking into that. So I think we'll have a chance to explore more during session 4. And Nihat, thank you for the question, and I'm happy to then follow up bilaterally with some of the observations that have been shared in the room. So I think that would be my short take on that online question. With this, I think we're very well on time, and I'm happy to give you back some minutes for coffee since you spent a lot of time at Prenegate. So let me just check there is not any final question or follow-up from the physical room. And if not, I think we can break for half an hour, get a coffee, refresh a bit, and then be back in 30 minutes for session 2 and the first big substantive panel. Thank you very much.
What's the order of march? Is it?
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to ask you to please take your seats. You will be able to resume your conversations in about an hour at lunch. So thank you very much for coming back for the second session of the day, both to those in person in the room and those online. So my name is Sarah Grant-Clement, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session, which will introduce different aspects of improvised SALW, IEDs, and UAS manufacturing, acquisition, and use. So this session will in particular explore the relevance of knowledge transfer networks in this process, and will unpack the unique role played by online communities and offline networks and connections in this layered acquisition process. And to do so, I'm joined by three excellent speakers. First, on my right is Rob Hunter-Perkins, who's Head of Research, Conflict Armament Research, or CAR. And then on my left, immediate left, is Patty Jin, Senior Expert, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, GTOC. And to my further left is Rajan Basra, Senior Research Fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, King's College London. In the interest of time, I won't read out our speakers' biographies, but you can find those in our participant pack. So this panel will introduce different angles of the issue, from use by non-state armed groups to the transfer of knowledge from conflict settings to organized crime, something which you've already heard about slightly in session one, but we'll dive into this deeper during this session. And we're also going to look at the role of online environments in the proliferation of improvised weapons. There will be time, as in the previous session, for Q&A and contributions from the floor, so both in-person and online participants. So please take note of any reflections or questions or comments that you wish to share when I open up the question and answer session. And it would be particularly great to hear if what the panel says resonates with you, your respective contexts, and your respective experiences. As with session one, this session is live streamed, so colleagues outside of Geneva will be following this session, and colleagues online, it's the same process as for the first session. There is the Slido page. The QR code will be shared, is currently shared on the screen, and you can also use the link that is on the YouTube page for any questions for our panel or other reflections, and we'll try our best to relay these to our speakers, provided we have sufficient time. But I have spoken for long enough, and so without any further ado, I will start first by handing the floor over to Rob. So Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me clearly. My name is Rob Hunter-Perkins. I work for Conflict Armament Research, or CAR. And I'd like to start by thanking you all for joining us today and thanking UNIDIR for organizing this very interesting conference and for the workshops earlier in the year that CAR was happy to participate in. So Conflict Armament Research, we work to investigate how non-state armed groups in active conflicts are able to acquire weapons, ammunition, and related material. Excellent, this works. We are led by a boots-on-the-ground methodology where we work in conflict zones with local defense and security force partners to physically document material when it is recovered from illicit and unauthorized armed groups and armed actors. And we're very much focused on material transfers as a priority and understanding how items are diverted to these groups and from them. And our work includes some groups that are harkening back to the earlier speaker, Ruben, some groups that are highly organized, that are relatively well-resourced, and maintain some level of de facto territorial control. You're thinking of groups like Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, Houthi forces in Yemen, and Jinim, ISWAP, Jazz, and ISSP in West Africa, among others. In some cases, these groups have been able to invest in sustained production and procurement efforts. Our field investigators in Iraq, for example, have documented semi-industrial efforts to produce IEDs and improvised weapons in the past. And in others, and certainly in the conventional weapons domain, what our evidence has actually pointed to is that despite their nominal resources, some of these groups have been effectively quite isolated, both from extraterritorial support and also from their allies within the region. And we've not documented the same level of self-production. So I'm thinking, for example, in West Africa, where we have been on the ground for about 10 years, We did a study earlier in the year looking at the movement of conventional weapons, small arms and light weapons between groups, and found actually that it was much less than we had anticipated. But we as an organization work to understand how these groups and a much wider array of non-state armed actors acquire their warfighting capabilities, and we provide governments and industry with verified evidence on patterns of illicit supply, production, and procurement. We do this by documenting the material, tracing it to recreate the supply chain, and I expect that it won't be possible to see the detail here, but this is an example network diagram where we map the procurement networks that sustain these acquisition efforts. This is from an old case. It's more indicative than anything else to show the type of work we do in this domain. It's from 2020 where we investigated efforts by Islamic State network to acquire material to produce UAVs and IEDs. Since CAR was founded in 2011, our field teams have worked on the ground in over 30 countries, and in that time there's been a major evolution in the nature of the battlefield evidence our field teams uncover. And the material scope of our investigations has had to expand in line with the changing nature of how conflicts are being fought. What we've seen in recent years, and this text may be a little small to see, so I'll read it out for you, but what we have seen is an increasing availability of technology, and that has greatly expanded the ability of non-state armed groups to carry out attacks and sustain conflict. As capabilities have evolved, we've seen declining barriers to production and access. And the net effect of that is that the gap in capabilities between national defense security sector and non-state armed groups has closed. And in some key areas, most particularly in UAVs, there is a growing overlap in both the technologies sought and the sources utilized to acquire that material. And when thinking about knowledge transfer, or more broadly, capability development support, I'd put some thought into this for this presentation, that there might be 3 levels at least to consider. The first being the strategic, where there is a political decision at a leadership level to support another actor on a sustained basis, perhaps even with the goal of enabling self-sufficiency. The tactical level, which would be operational, maybe transactional reasons where technology or information is shared, not for ideological reasons or between allied groups, but perhaps simply as a quid pro quo transactional relationship. And the third being almost inadvertent, where there's not necessarily an intention behind it, but groups are looking to parrot and replicate TTPs that are shown to work, or where people are fishing in the same pond for material access and are learning from each other and seeing what is available in the public space and trying to learn from each other to adopt techniques that may work. I'm going to highlight 3 key dynamics that we're seeing in our field investigations that reflect the drivers behind non-state armed groups' acquisition efforts, and that may speak maybe more to this third dynamic of the inadvertent. So firstly, and this has been touched on already, the declining barriers to access. So as an organization, our exposure to UAVs has largely mirrored the evolution and proliferation of the systems themselves, especially their adoption by non-state armed groups. When we were formed in 2011, UAVs were pretty much the preserve of states, and just a few of those at that. And the use of them by non-state groups was isolated and rare, and largely for surveillance and reconnaissance purposes only. As they've proliferated across conflicts and have grown in both complexity and technical capability, so too have UAVs moved from the periphery of our work to the core. First-person view UAVs, for example, that's FPVs. They've been around for quite a long time in the hobbyist sense, but they were entirely absent from our documentations until relatively recently. But in the last 18 months or so, they've begun to pop up and do so with increasing speed in the recovered material that our investigators access. We've now observed them, as the slide shows, in 8 of the conflict operations in which we work. And the agility, speed, and maneuverability of FPVs is something of a game changer for a lot of non-state groups. It's something that has been given a prominent shop window in the Ukraine conflicts for several years now, and so it's no surprise to see other users seek to adopt their capabilities, and I'm sure other speakers will be able to reflect on that in more detail. The second dynamic is evidence of efforts by some groups to adapt and adopt new commercial offerings. This is a case from Yemen from last year, where in August of 2024, security forces seized a dhow fishing vessel that was intended for the Houthis. And our investigators documented a portion of the recovered cargo. The cargo comprised of a mix of componentry for missile development, it included commercial UAVs, and among the cargo were these carbon fiber gas tanks that you can see a few examples of in the picture. They were labeled, when we documented them, as oxygen cylinders, but our investigators were able to prove that the cylinders actually contained hydrogen, and transfer documents recovered with the gas tanks indicated clearly that the cylinders were part of a fuel cell system intended for use in either UAVs or another uncrewed vehicle. And the use of hydrogen to power uncrewed vehicles is a relatively novel technology. We'd never encountered it in the field before, and we're not aware of its use anywhere previously by a non-state armed group. Hydrogen-powered UAVs are reported to have a greater range, up to 3 times that of a traditional lithium battery, and much quieter, similar range, but much quieter and more efficient than gas and diesel engines. Hydrogen-powered UAVs have been advertised by some manufacturers, but only relatively recently. And we assessed the timeline from the advertising to the attempted adoption by the Houthis to be at most 2 years, and probably significantly shorter. The last point to say about that is we don't believe that the Houthis have been successful in this instance, and we think that the successful adoption of this technology remains a technical challenge, not only for the Houthis, but for other non-state armed groups. But again, thinking about inadvertent knowledge transfer when something is deemed to be successful or shown to be successful and replicable, groups seek to learn from each other. And then finally, the other main trend we see in UAV modification by non-state armed groups is efforts to identify low-cost solutions to resource challenges. One of these areas is, and it's been mentioned already, is using 3D printing to modify UAVs. We've documented a few cases where there's been attempts to create release mechanisms using 3D printing, as shown here in the Zoom. We've only seen a very limited sample of this, and it's only for modifications to existing commercial systems, not for components that are integral to UAV's core functioning. And then the other area is the repurposing of conventional ammunition to create explosive payloads, and the thing that makes the UAVs most lethal and that a lot of non-state armed groups are seeking to adopt and do still is to plug in an explosive payload to a commercial system. And very often when we've documented those items, that has involved wholesale or repurposed conventional ammunition that itself has been diverted, lost, or stolen from an authorized custodian. The slide I showed a little earlier of the FPV remnants, that sharp-eyed among you may have noticed, included a warhead section of an RPG, and that had been used as the payload for that FPV. This is something we see across our operations. Again, we work in conflict zones, so very often that material may inherently be more accessible to non-state armed actors than in other countries that we're addressing today. And I'll just finish very quickly with a couple of takeaways thinking of session 4 about countering access and acquisition. The first is that, in our experience, a characteristic of these weapons is that there's challenges regarding their traceability, but they're not inherently completely untraceable. They are sometimes comprised of or include commercial components that can be traced, and we've had some success in doing so with manufacturers. Secondly, while the technical genie is unlikely to go back completely into the bottle, it is possible to degrade the ability of non-state armed groups to acquire key components needed to develop more capable systems. And measures taken at the very start of a supply chain can have the greatest impact in doing so, including the targeting of critical supply chain choke points and enhancing risk assessments for material that has been shown from evidence by organizations like us to be especially valued by non-state armed groups. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, in creating drone deployable munitions, our experience is that non-state armed groups seek to acquire conventional materials, conventional ammunition, grenades, mortars, rockets, RPGs. And this points to the continuing importance of quite traditional solutions that have been well discussed in this space, namely PSSM efforts, to curtail access to the material that has the greatest potential to maximize the UAV threat posed by non-state groups. I'll stop there and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Rob. Actually, if you don't mind, can I ask you 2 quick fire questions before turning to the next speaker? The first one is, do you actually see a difference in impact between these improvised weapons in terms of their impact on the ground, in terms of lethality or something like that? And the second, you mentioned kind of challenges with regards to tracing. So this is perhaps then due to the fact that these companies producing commercial items do not have the same standards of marking as we would expect from companies producing actual military equipment.
this has gone. In terms of impact, I wouldn't say that we have data on that systemically to be able to assess an increased or decreased level of impact. One thing I'm minded about, though, is once did a research engagement with UNOCT on the global baseline of UAV experience. And there was a Middle Eastern state that spoke about a kind of 6-phase experience they'd had of kind of a cat and mouse exchange with non-state groups in trying to prevent and detect UAVs. And they said that their countermeasures had been extremely effective, and the only times that they had failed or been evaded was when there'd been a major shift in the comprising of the UAV. And that is often making it more sophisticated to evade existing measures. But I think in at least some cases, it's also less sophisticated. It's almost using, sometimes the ones that were hard to detect were the ones that were almost completely fabricated, because they were kind of operating in a way that didn't kind of conform with what was expected by the counter UAV solutions. So that maybe is an area of potential impact or threat to be concerned about for these systems. On traceability, I brought it up mainly, I mean, I had it in my slides already, but I brought it up mainly because I was struck by Paul's comment earlier about thinking of characteristic-based definitions and things that these systems all have in common. And one of those being that there is enhanced difficulty around tracing and responding to them from an investigative standpoint. It's a general characteristic that these items are not produced or primarily composed of items with serialized or traceable markings. And so there are comparatively narrow entry points for investigators. And I was thinking about, what are the value of these systems to non-state groups? Because I think it's fair to say you wouldn't necessarily choose an improvised solution if a commercial one was available. But if there are benefits, one of those is that they may evade detection and deterrence measures. But again, it's a feature that unifies the weapons, but it's a bit of a misnomer because there are either traceable commercial components within these items, or as I mentioned with the warhead of the FPV, we were able to trace that item. It had lot markings on it. So we were actually able to find out where that warhead came from. There was a really interesting example, though, in terms of dealing with a wider community of actors. An FPV we documented contained a computer chip. We traced it. It had a marking on it that we thought was potentially traceable. We contacted the manufacturer. They explained that that was a batch mark, but they'd been using that same batch mark since 2019. And this was, I think, 2024 that we were tracing it. And they've been using the same batch marking because they were a very small company and they were concerned that changing it was going to affect their quality assurance procedures. They didn't think it was basically necessary to integrate measures like that. And it was as a result of our evidence, we weren't able to trace that item because they had no further information, but they have changed their practices as a result of our investigation. And I think we have definitely seen some instances where there are actors who basically are completely unaware of the potential risk and implication of the material they produce and are not necessarily instigating the measures they need to as commercial actors. So yeah, it's an area for growth for sure.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's been fascinating also to hear from your expertise, especially those longitudinal data that you have. I think that really brings flavor to how the things have changed in the field, sorry. But next, I want to pass it to you, Paddy. So here's the pointer, and please take it away.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for organizing this UNIDIR. So my talk is going to focus on how knowledge moves from the conflict zones, how the instructions, the skills and techniques for making improvised weapons circulate between people, places, and platforms. Today, improvised firearms, explosives, and drones are spreading not because the material are suddenly abundant, but because knowledge is easier than ever to acquire and transfer. This shift is at the heart of the challenge, and it's being driven by three interconnected systems: conflict zones that generate new expertise, online platforms that distribute it more widely, and offline networks that turn it into operational capability. Our GITOC research with Ukrainian drone operators shows how quickly innovation has accelerated in war. Drones are now used for surveillance, logistics, long-range strikes, precision attacks, precision attacks, and navigation through heavy electronic warfare. Operators have learned how to extend communications, bypass jamming, chain multiple relay stations, and modify commercial platforms far beyond their intended use. And this knowledge does not remain in Ukraine. It travels with foreign volunteers, diaspora networks, drone technicians, and online operators. As mentioned earlier, in one case reported recently, a Mexican cartel member joined the International Legion explicitly to learn battlefield drone skills. Illustrating a wider trend, war produces skills at scale, and those skills move. Our research points to online communities having become de facto classrooms for improvised weapons. They provide the step-by-step guides to making explosives, the CAD files for 3D printed gun parts, the wiring diagrams for firing circuits, and the instructions for turning commercial drones into delivery or attack platforms. So users across the world analyze each other's mistakes, share these improved designs, and create standardized recipes. And as a result, improvised weapons are becoming more reliable. And with the batteries, motors, autopilots, spare parts available on major online marketplaces, almost anyone with an internet connection can begin experimenting. Online communities improve the learning curve dramatically. But despite the reach of online information, improvised production still relies heavily on offline networks, the people, especially young people. Small workshops, skilled engineers, experienced drone pilots, electronic specialists, and supply chain facilitators. It is the people that are the heart of the capability. Our research shows clearly that these people are the core enablers. Engineers assemble the airframes and modify the firmware. Workshop operators access the 3D printers or CNC tools. The pilots test and refine the systems under real conditions. And the logisticians source the specialized batteries, the antennas, the guidance modules. It is these networks where returning fighters contribute the most. They bring that experience, that visceral understanding, the tacit knowledge gained under battlefield pressure, which criminal networks quickly absorb and are actively seeking. So DDR processes must consider this as a factor. The offline networks are therefore the missing link. They turn easily available online knowledge into functioning improvised weapons. The combined effect of conflict knowledge, often online tutorials and offline workshops, is driving new forms of criminal activity across the three domains of air, land, and sea. We see criminal actors copying the methods developed in conflict zones, even if they cannot access the same equipment. So in the air domain, looking at the example of cross-border smuggling, criminals have adopted similar approaches in other regions. Weapon smuggling by drone along the Egypt-Israel border. Drug-laden drones intercepted moving from Syria into Jordan, Iran into Azerbaijan, Pakistan into India, and Mexican cartels using drones for reconnaissance and delivery. This shows that criminal actors copy the tactics, not the hardware. Lessons about night flights and autonomous routing and operating with small teams refined in Ukraine are easily adapted for smuggling elsewhere. Looking at a second example in the air domain, FPV drones with precision steering, AI-assisted tracking, and improvised explosive payloads began in military use and now appear in criminal and extremist plots. We've spoken about those today. Explosive dropping drones used by cartels in Mexico and in Rio, and disruptive plots in Europe involving drones targeting political figures. Conflict zones demonstrate what drones can do against defended targets. Once that idea is visible and instructional content appears online, criminal adoption accelerates. Looking at the sea domain, maritime drones offer high-value smuggling options. Ukraine's sea drones provide a model that criminal groups are imitating. Spanish authorities have seized underwater drones used for cocaine transport, and criminal engineers are openly discussing surface drone last mile delivery from offshore vessels. So conflict zones again reveal that uncrewed maritime systems are viable and cost effective. Criminals adapt this principle, and if a sea drone can strike a warship, it can certainly deliver a high value drug shipment. And then finally on the land domain, looking at the example of ground drones for logistics or intimidation, criminal groups have begun exploring similar systems. Small UGVs moving drugs through urban areas, and experiments with armed robotic platforms for intimidation. So bring all this together, the same conclusions emerge. Criminals don't need the military-grade systems, only the concepts. Once they understand the tactic, they can replicate it with commercial parts. Conflict knowledge spreads quickly via people, platforms, and partnerships, and ideas are now the main proliferation vector. And ideas can't be controlled at borders. So using our model of the functions in crime framework, we can see that knowledge transfer supports in the following areas. Command, you see remote coordination. Intelligence, real-time surveillance. Movement, new smuggling routes. Protection, greater anonymity. Force, drone-based coercion. Logistics, decentralized production. And secure communications for information. These new ideas and concepts are shaping the structure of criminal operations themselves. What does this mean for prevention and response? Well, we think there are three implications. We've got to understand the knowledge, not the hardware, as the primary driver of proliferation. Interventions should focus on offline hubs, workshops, engineers, procurement nodes, the people, because this is where online knowledge becomes real-world capability. And then thirdly, states and institutions need their own defensive knowledge networks, systems that share forensic findings, detect emerging trends early, and understand online instructional pathways, anticipating new improvisation methods. It's these networks that will be the barrier of protection in the future. So to conclude, improvised weapons spread through networks, through human networks, online networks, and networks shaped by conflict. If we understand these networks and engage them directly, we have a real chance of slowing or preventing the spread of these capabilities. Ignoring them, or criminals and armed groups will continue to innovate faster than our responses. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Paddy. This was really enlightening, and it brought a few kind of initial maybe reflections to mind. If criminal groups are militarizing, then that means, or using military tactics, then that means the response, so by the police, will then also become more militarized, and the subsequent implications this has. But maybe a quick follow-on question, also a lightning question, is there a particular type of criminal group or a kind of crime that tends to kind of take up these practices over others, or do you not see a difference whatsoever between types of groups?
That's an excellent question. I think I'll answer it in two ways. The first is to talk about the consistent arms race that you see in the use of violence by criminal groups. And this is where they adopt a particular tactic or capability, and then the knowledge spread of improvised capabilities leads to increased violence, which then the law enforcement attempt to counter with increased militarization of their responses. And then you see the next step up and the next step up. And you see the example of these, the classic example of these is in Mexico in the Jalisco cartels and the Zetas, which have become effectively like armed battle groups and equip themselves with every capability they can get their hand on, and improvised capabilities are absolutely one of those. The response by law enforcement is increasingly militarized, and the human cost of that is felt in the population. I think I'll probably leave it there. Actually, I think there are some other points that I'll come to in discussion afterwards. I hope that's okay.
That is perfectly fine. Thank you very much, Kadi, again. And last but certainly not least, Rajan, over to you, please. You have the floor.
Thank you. So to understand knowledge transfer when it comes to 3D printed firearms, I think it makes sense to go back to the very first 3D printed firearm, published online by this man, Cody Wilson. He's an American law student at the time. And he essentially proved that you could use 3D printing to create a viable firearm. And you can do this at home, fully DIY. And in doing so, he planted the flag for other firearms enthusiasts to get involved and develop this technology further. And he did this despite the gun that he designed, the Liberator, being pretty clunky. You could only fire it a single time before you need to reload it. And even then, the gun was liable to falling apart in your hands when you do fire it. But he started this movement and people did get involved very organically, just messaging online. And so if we fast forward just 7 years from the release of that gun, we get the landmark FGC9. And the name really states what the gun is all about. That was designed and published online by a German national called Jacob Doigu, better known by his pseudonym J-Stark 1809. He released the files online for anyone to download and then to use, but he was then continuing the mission of Cody Wilson in developing 3D printed firearms. And the difference between this and the Liberator is night and day. You could see it's semi-automatic, it's accurate, it's reliable, and best of all, from their perspective, it's still fully DIY. You can make this at home. And what's more, J-Stark uploaded the files with a meticulous step-by-step instructional guide, which if you follow, you'll eventually have a working firearm in your hands. And since then, we've seen many other guns designed. So just last year, there was the release of the Notter Glock, styled after a compact Glock pistol. We saw the Rogue 9 and then the Uru Tau. These are two guns that are modifications of the FGC9 with different features like a suppressor, foldable stock, and a bullpup design. But we could see dramatic improvements in this technology in just over a decade. So what explains this? It's not just because 3D printers are cheaper. It's not just because there's software available that people could use. It's because there are humans involved. We're dealing with a real social network, a social movement that is known as GunCAD, or Gun Computer Aided Design. It's otherwise known as 3D2A, which is 3D Second Amendment. And I've spent several years at King's College London looking at GunCAD, the forums, the communities online to see how they operate and how they behave. And when you look at the people involved, we must say that mostly they're firearms enthusiasts and hobbyists. They're people that just love guns. They love designing them, they love making them, and they love shooting them. And they're often doing this without getting paid. They're in it just for the love of the game, devoting countless hours and time for this. With that said, there is an ideological current throughout the movement where they consider it a human right, a universal human right to bear firearms. And so they're heavily influenced by US Second Amendment culture, and they're looking to take that and make it a global thing. So they'll produce content such as this, encouraging the adoption of 3D printed firearms in the EU. They produce posters like this, encouraging protesters in Hong Kong to make 3D printed firearms to use against the Chinese government there, and many more examples besides. But that ideological component is really encapsulated in the slogan that they use, which is "Come and take it," is defiance against the state. So we have to understand the ideological reasoning for many people involved. But the movement is also diverse and surprisingly diverse. As is to be expected, you would find many right-wing libertarians and also people even further right on the political spectrum. But there are also left-wing activists, there are anarchists involved in this movement, and they're able to generally coexist online in these spaces because they all share the common goal of developing 3D printed firearms. And of course, like any social movement, you'll find many rivalries that occur between different groups involved and different individuals. And these tend to center on the direction of the movement, ego clashes, of which there are many, and of course, money, because some people are making money with certain designs by selling components for people to buy. So if that's a bit about the movement, you could see some of these things are going to constrain knowledge transfers. Other things are going to encourage knowledge transfer. But what are they actually doing? Well, they're doing three things. They are designing 3D printed firearms, they're sharing the blueprints online, and they're promoting their use. So designing, where does that happen? Well, mostly in so-called beta groups or prototype testing groups. And these are used to test new designs, find any errors, refine the guides, and then publicly release them for other people to use. And these groups can be open, they can be closed. Open in the sense that anyone could join them, you could join them, I can join them. You don't have to use your real name, you could be based anywhere in the world. Some are closed in that you need to ask for permission from whoever controls that group for access. And then there may be some minimal vetting. You may have to prove that you've got, a working 3D printer, you've printed other guns, and you may be tested on whether you can be trusted as well. And these beta groups tend to exist on Rocket Chat, on the Element Matrix protocol, and also on Discord. There are other platforms that are used. You'll find some activity on Telegram, and then a smaller platform called SimpleX. But these three are the main ones. And once the design has been refined, all the mistakes have been ironed out, it's then shared online, and primarily that occurs on odyssey.com. Other websites and platforms like Telegram, some standalone websites do exist for the sharing of these blueprints, but Odyssey for several years has really been the home for all of the STL, the CAD files, and the design guides. And Odyssey presents itself as being this decentralized file sharing, content sharing platform that's takedown resistant. But before Odyssey, these files were hosted on different platforms. So it proves that they can move if necessary. And once it's published, well, then they promote on mainstream platforms. They're not spending time on the dark web. They want to make this as accessible and as mainstream as possible. So you'll find many posts on X and also on Reddit. It's worth saying, just a few months ago, Reddit decided to shut down the main subreddit called FOSCAD, where people would share videos of upcoming designs in the beta testing or prototype phase and working final designs. And that community, FOSCAD, had over 100,000 subscribers, just to give you a scale of the level of interest. And just last week, they shut down another subreddit, which is called FOSCAD 2. So at the moment, the community is in a bit of a state of flux. It's trying to find new homes online to continue the promotion of this content. But if we zoom out, what I would say about GunCAD, about the 3D printed firearms movement, is that they're very resilient, adaptive, and they're competent. They're resilient because many leading figures have actually been arrested, they've moved away from the scene, some have even died, but other people come to take their place and continue championing the cause of 3D printed firearms. They're adaptive because many of these groups have been kicked off different platforms online, and then they just migrate to another place and eventually settle down and make that their home. And they are competent. I mean, some of these groups are pretty organized, they're very capable, and they're producing designs that have been seen around the world, including many of the member states that are gathered in this room today. So this is just a very brief snapshot of the 3D printed firearms movement. There's a lot to say, but it's just to kickstart the discussion for this session and throughout the rest of the day. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajan. This was fascinating to hear. And it seems that across the three presentations, we really have this sense of gaps reducing, whether that's between non-state armed groups and the militaries, or criminal groups and the militaries, or even between civilians who should not be accessing these weapons and those who legally, are enabled to use these or develop these weapons. Perhaps two quick follow-up questions before I open up the floor more broadly for questions. The first one is, what is the scale of the issue, both in terms of the amount of people, but also geographically of this phenomenon? And the second one is, do you see, does AI play a role in either the designing, sharing, or promoting of these aspects? Because I can see that maybe the use of bots to kind of, take over and share this being an issue, especially the challenge of taking down bots. So, over to you.
Yeah. So when it comes to the scale, I mean, the Reddit subreddit, FOSCAD, was a bit of an outlier with 100,000 members. But the other platforms that you see on the screen here, the membership can vary to just a few thousand members. The core designers, I would say, number probably less than 100 people involved. The scale in the actual beta testing groups, this again can vary from less than a dozen people up to a few hundred working on prototype designs. It's like any social movement. You're going to have a smaller number of people that sit at the core and are really passionate and pushing the boundaries. And then you're going to have many more people that sit on the periphery and are generally supportive, getting involved here and there. The scale geographically is interesting because we've seen 3D printed firearms pop up in pretty much every continent in the world, bar Antarctica. And I think they're only going to continue to spread even more. In terms of the numbers, I would maybe actually call on Ruben, because Ruben's been keeping a database of all known seizures of 3D printed firearms. And then I can talk about the AI issue.
Thank you, Rajan. So in terms of the scale, I think, so I'll quote some statistics from my research, which is based on purely open source media reports of seizures, right? And we're seeing out of 325 cases from 2013 right up to August 2025, we've seen almost 50% of the cases have occurred in North America. So that's US and Canada. We've seen about 25% in Europe. We're seeing a growing number in Australia and New Zealand as well. And we've seen these firearms pop up also in Latin America, particularly in Brazil. As Rajan mentioned, it's almost in every continent at the moment, right? And a lot of these seizures are linked to criminal sort of enterprises as opposed to terrorism cases. Terrorism cases comprise of only about 17 to 20% of the cases, and most of the offenses involved are manufacture, possession, and trafficking.
Just to add to that, I mean, it's clear that the beating heart of the movement is in the US. Although there are supporters and people involved around the world, it really centers on the US, where it is for most people entirely legal to make a firearm at home. And so they're able to take advantage of that. Doesn't stop some of them from also crossing over into illegality in the US, but that's really where the home of it is. On the AI question, we haven't really seen it used to a great extent. Sometimes they use it to promote material, to create videos, to create posters and images. And I would say at the moment, they're using AI just like everyone else is using AI. They're putting in prompts to come up with some entertaining imagery, but it hasn't been incorporated into the design of these firearms or anything on I would say, a more sophisticated level than that.
Many thanks, Rajan. This is really interesting. And thank you to all the speakers. I now wish to open the floor for any questions from the audience, both in person and online. I already see one hand. Theo, please take the floor, and then I'll say one hand there. I'll take your question afterwards. Thank you. Or comment. I don't know if it's a question. Please.
Well, I mean, thank you very much for the super interesting discussion. It's a bit of a two-part question. The first one would be more for Rob. Like, how would you compare engaging with commercial actors that are not used to dealing with these sort of issues, like drone manufacturers that are bringing to the defense realm, basically, and how does that compare with engaging with legitimate industrial actors that are doing weapons and ammunition? And the second part of the question, I guess, would be to Rajan. I mean, that was super interesting. My question would be like, I haven't picked up on these yet, but like, are we starting to see these 3D printed guns in like conflict zones, not just like enthusiasts and gangs and stuff like this, but like in actual conflict zones? Yeah, sorry, Theo with Amnesty International.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more. Yes, gentleman over there and lady at the back, and then we'll wrap up this round.
Thank you very much. Liam Smith, I work at the Frontier AI Lab, Anthropic. On this question of how that technology is being used, it strikes me that probably not in the design phase as of yet, but a common thread was expert humans being a transmission point for knowledge to less able individuals. With the proliferation of open source models out in the world, and particularly without what I would consider to be appropriate levels of safeguards in place, it strikes me that that would probably be the first place that you would see a significant increase in particularly LLM technology being used to replace the expert human in terms of dissemination. And I wondered if you'd seen anything akin to that in the research work that you guys have been doing.
Thank you. And lady at the back, please.
I'm Katie Paul. I'm from the Tech Transparency Project in Washington, D.C. My question was largely for Rajan, but really for anybody. You mentioned that a lot of the people, particularly for 3D printed weapons that post on things like YouTube, do it as a hobby. But we found that there's a lot of monetization of this content, and it's incredibly lucrative, so much so that it took quite a bit of time for YouTube to even create a policy age gating that content. Their automation tools and their algorithmic amplification were amplifying deliberately illegal content, particularly to kids. So what role do you think the monetization tools of major social media platforms play in amplifying that kind of content?
Thank you. So three pretty tough questions. Maybe we'll go in the order that you presented in, if that works with you. So Rob, Badi, and then Rajan to answer those questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Theo, for the question. So the question was about our experience of working with actors, particularly those producing commercial materials, as opposed to those operating in the kind of more kind of military defense sector. Generally, I would characterize our experience as we've had quite a lot of high level of engagement, and I think broadly speaking, this is very much a generalization, quite a high appetite to engage and kind of take on board the evidence that we're presenting. I think I could make that generalization both for very large component producers and also much smaller specialized companies. And I think particularly with those, there's also a kind of an appetite for support in making sure that they're kind of doing the effective due diligence that they're required to do. But we've seen companies take steps that they're not legally required to do in terms of trying to safeguard technology that they themselves have identified as not eligible for dual use controls, but still sensitive nonetheless. There was a company who was exporting GNSS modules. These were commercially available items, but they did so under end-use certificates, which they themselves had kind of originated to try and get their retailers to comply with EU-level restrictions in terms of resale. That was just something they did off their own bat. And I think there are companies that are looking to try and like find ways to make sure that their products don't end up in the press, that they don't end up like, seen involved in illicit activities. And there's been a bit of a sectoral wake-up call in the last few years, mainly I think in relation to the Ukraine and the co-option of Western, predominantly Western components in Russian, Iranian, and North Korean advanced conventional weapon systems. What I'd say as a tandem to that is that practices vary, but the further down the supply chain you get, I think the less kind of clarity and control there is around the supply chains and less of a understanding of things like record keeping of serial numbers and things like that. So often our investigative trail can go cold at the second or third point of a resale supply chain. And I think that's maybe the great area for improvement, is looking at kind of downstream responsibility and accountability. So yeah, I'll stop there for time. Thanks.
Just to add, 3D printed firearms have been used in conflict zones. Famously in Myanmar, they were used by rebels fighting against the military junta, but primarily as a way of sort of getting started on the ladder of conventional firearms. So they would use them in ambush attacks to seize conventionally manufactured firearms, or they would say they would use them in defensive actions because they found that due to the rigors of the battlefield, after a while, you do want something that's primarily made of metal. But it's been a really interesting use, and we've seen some collaboration there as well between the people on the battlefield and people involved in the designs on how to make them, how to improve them, to fix certain flaws as well. So that's primarily where we've seen them in terms of conflict zones. Aside from that, I think of what's the appeal of a 3D printed firearm is that you could make a gun at home without the authorities knowing about it. And so we've seen many plots, primarily in Europe, by would-be terrorists, would-be attackers, primarily from the far right, who are looking to make 3D printed firearms. It seems to have taken off particularly well from their perspective in that movement. But beyond that, it's fairly limited.
Thanks, and Paddy, over to you.
Thank you. I'll skip through the three questions. So the first one, yes, we are yet, in Myanmar specifically, we're yet to get to the stage where 3D printed firearms are replacing military supply chains. But that's not the case for drones and IEDs. Drones and IEDs, because they bring a different type of capability, are replacing military supply chains. The second question, I think, to do with LLMs replacing the human, I don't think that is ever going to be the case, because the human brings the visceral combat experience and that learned experience of not just using the capability in the battle space, but also developing the capability in the battle space. I think that's the key thing that you're never going to get away from in what I refer to as the offline networks, personally. And I know nothing about the monetization of YouTube, so I'll hand that across to my learned colleague.
Sure. Cheers, Paddy. So just before that, on the prospect of LLMs, I haven't seen it used at scale by people involved in this movement. And I think it's worth looking at their ideological worldview. They're inherently skeptical of the authorities, and engaging with an LLM for them may be seen as a vulnerability, may be reported to the police, to the authorities. And so they would be a little bit hesitant, I would say, en masse to engage with that. Now, they may still develop in-house tools, in-house LLMs, and so on. But let's not forget also, these tools can be good for researchers. I mean, I feed in some of the gun PDFs and guides into an LLM, and if I've got questions about how these have been created, I just ask an LLM. So I think there are pluses and minuses to that. On the topic of monetization, you're absolutely right, Katie, that we've seen this on YouTube most famously. And some of the content creators have been very careful to stay within YouTube's T's and C's, which hasn't stopped YouTube actually from banning several accounts. And recently, they did a sort of wholesale policy change to the content related to firearms. So this has driven a lot of people to get involved. There is a lot of money to be made in 3D printed firearms in countries where it's legal, like in the US. And that is one thing that's really driving the rivalries between different actors. But many of them have been kicked off YouTube. They've had to move to different platforms to maybe raise donations, using other fundraising platforms as well. So I think this will always be a part of it, because there is a market for this type of content. People love to watch videos about guns. People love to buy gun parts. So there are going to be people there looking to make money, for sure.
Great, many thanks. I think we have time for at least one more round of questions. Is there anybody else in the room who would like to ask a question? Please raise your hand so I can actually see you, otherwise a bit short. Otherwise, I'll ask the question that we've had online, and please do still raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Online, we've had a question from the presentations. I take that knowledge sharing on weapons also goes beyond ideology and groups' ideological affiliations. Is this correct? I don't see any other questions in the room. So maybe I will take my moderator privilege and ask my own question, which I've been waiting to ask. So we've talked a lot about the current issues, the current kind of what we're seeing happening now. And I want to ask, what do you see as future trends that maybe you see now as something that's not quite, established, but that could be relevant in the future and that policymakers should be taking into account now, and perhaps something we can touch upon in session 4 again in terms of kind of proactive policymaking. So maybe those two questions, and whoever wants to start with those. Thank you.
So on future trends related to 3D printed firearms, I think that there's a current focus, and this will stick around for a while, on smaller form factors like the not a Glock. You want to have a pistol that's very concealable, that's reliable, it's powerful caliber. So that will probably continue, I think. But beyond just the technical side of things, I think the social movement, it's going to become much more organized. They're almost forced to do so. They're forced to move from different platforms, set up their own websites, compiling lists of known contributors, and overall just becoming a lot more organized, sort of quasi-professional in how they operate online, how they vet people, how they test these designs. And I think that will continue into the future.
Thank you. Yes, Paddy.
Thank you. I think on weapons ideology, yes, it does go weapons sort of sharing of the knowledge. It does go beyond ideology, and criminal groups and non-state armed groups are attempting to acquire the knowledge, irrespective of their ideology. I know that the ideology drives what they're doing, but in the armed state groups, but criminals know that they are attempting to acquire, and they're attempting to acquire the people, which is a critical factor. In terms of future trends, so Pandora's box is open. The world, I know this is a bit sort of high level and sort of global strategic, but we are seeing more state-on-state conflicts, and therefore there is more conflict that is that real essence of the crucible of innovation. And if you follow the theory that war is the crucible of innovation, you are seeing more and more bleed out from those conflict zones, those state-on-state conflict zones specifically, because that's where mass of state resource is forced into the arms race. And when that state resource gets forced into the arms race, then you see this rapid innovation, much more so than, I would argue, much more so than non-state-on-state conflict. And that is bleeding out, not just in terms of the online material, but in terms of the offline. And the critical factor there is the people. And so in the future, you could argue that there are going to be more people, more experienced, more capable with knowledge of these skills and capabilities and the tactics and the experience, et cetera, and they're then going to go into those online areas and drive forward the capabilities, the innovative capabilities that criminal groups and non-state armed groups are seeking to acquire. That, I think, is the critical thing. That also has an attendant factor, which is how these people change the culture of gun ownership in their home states. And I think we are seeing globally changes in gun ownership culture in certain states that are also a result of conflict, state-on-state conflict. And that is deeply worrying, because then there is a more receptive environment for knowledge transfer of improvised capabilities. And that is concerning. And I think we've got to address that in the various multilateral tools that we use. Thank you.
Bob, did you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the two questions on the online query that came through about whether this goes beyond ideological. I would turn only to the kind of conceptual framework I mentioned in the presentation of the levels of the strategic, the tactical and the inadvertent. I think ideology is obviously a factor, but perhaps is not the only one. But at the strategic level, it probably is key, both in terms of motive and opportunity, because you're talking about higher cost, more sustained, higher value transfer of information or resources. But when you get to those other levels, I don't think it's the only thing that plays a part, profit incentive or just allied cause for short-term joint venture of some sort can be significant or sufficient. And then with the inadvertent, it seems that like what we've all been talking about is where people are pursuing, they're not trying to spread knowledge, they're just carrying out their own activities and trying to achieve their own objectives. But they're doing so in such a way that it is public information and there for people to see. It's available online, it's advertised globally, and everyone's looking to learn from each other. On emerging threats or things to flag, thinking from the kind of conflict space, because I guess the three of us each represent a kind of different dimension of this problem. I mentioned at the start about the groups, some of the groups that we work to counter diversion to and from are technically well-resourced and highly capable, but they're also maybe behind the curve to a lot of the groups in the criminal or terrorism space. For the last decade that we've been documenting UAVs, still there's a lot of groups who are not as advanced as, say, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in 2015 were in terms of weaponizing commercial systems and simply kind of fairly rudimentary release mechanisms. So you're probably going to see a growing spread of efforts to achieve what IS led the way in 2015, if you like. There's plenty of conflict zones we work in where UAVs are still not present or are reported but not kind of materializing in common seizures. I expect that to change. That is already changing fast. Paddy talked about maritime systems. That's something I think that I would anticipate kind of broadening out. There's some of these trends that we've been talking about, like 3D printed firearms. You said that they have been used in conflict, but rarely. We've never documented one in the conflicts we work in. And the reason we surmise is simply because of the availability of conventional small arms and light weapons. There's no need to go for the higher opportunity cost of developing your own system, except in the kind of quite interesting niche case you mentioned in Myanmar of trying to access that material in the first place. So some of these things are not necessarily going to cascade and filter through to all countries equally. But I do think the maritime dimension is one where I could expect to see some change.
Sorry, if I could just add something else that comes to mind in terms of future threats and developments. The GunCAD, the 3D printed firearm movement is really dedicated to ensuring that you can make ammunition at home as well. And there do exist guides that are accurate, they do work, but they're looking to continually refine that to make it easier for people to not only make a gun at home, but also to make ammunition to use with that gun at home. So that's something also to be on the lookout for.
It's definitely something to be aware of. And I was told I missed a question in the room from Chris. So I don't know if you still want to ask the question. Yes. And if there's anybody else, I'm afraid we won't have the time, but Chris, you have the last word. So over to you.
Thank you. It was building on some of the other questions there and for the panel of talking about, I guess, Rajan, probably more in your space, displacement, which is one of my favorite words in the crime space of where we push them next. So where there's some voluntary action being taken that we're aware of on Reddit and Telegram and other kind of forums where we will push them and getting ahead of that and making sure we're there to kind of catch them. And I just wanted to say, fascinating panel. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to UNIDR for bringing these kind of people together, because what you're seeing, and trying not to steal Paul's kind of thunder later or his sandwiches, this is bringing you guys together and all of those problems, as you just pointed out, Rob, the human element, the military element, and then kind of that kind of lone actor element is exactly what we're here to do today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think with those words, it's a fitting end to this session. So really a big round of applause to our three speakers for joining us. For those in the room, there will be more chances to discuss and exchange, namely on some of the what can we do about this, what are the measures that can be taken. We'll explore those in session 4. But before that, we do have session 3, which will be looking at specific case studies. We'll be coming back to those aspects in the afternoon. But now we are going to break for lunch. So For those online, thank you very much for having followed. We'll be ending the live stream now. For those of you in person, we'll be resuming at 1 p.m. For now, we'll go to lunch. It's a bit of a complicated way, so please make sure that you follow colleagues so you know where you're going. Colleagues will raise their hands so you know who to follow. They're around the back of the room on the sides. Yeah, we're going to the 8th floor, so please don't get lost, and see you after the lunch break. Thank you.